So the question is, what do you do when you're dealing with a busy mix that might have a lot of overdubs, synth tracks, and other instrumentation that are conflicting with your guitar tracks? And what do you do when a client sends you a project to mix or edit without DI tracks? Welcome to Viewer Questions Answered, episode 17, I think, 17. So without any further ado, let's dive into this excellent group of questions. We have some good ones today. And our first question comes from Mr. Adam. Hey Bobby, how do I set a finish line for myself? I'm a first timer mixing my own band's album, and while my mix is good, I know in the back of my mind that it can always be better, so I find myself unable to decide when to stop working on it and to actually release it. What can I do to convince myself to wrap up a project? Adam, this is an awesome question, and let me tell you, it's something that every single one of us face, especially as producers and mixing engineers or musicians in general. Because here's the thing, if you work on a project without a deadline, you can literally work on it forever. I mentioned this in a previous video. I once had a band in, and this is not an exaggeration, in my studio, working on an album for 5 years. I am not exaggerating. Now, we didn't work on it continuously like every single week or every single day for 5 years, but they would come in, maybe we would do guitars, then they would come in a few months later and touch up those guitars, then we would do bass, then they would go back and redo some guitars, then we would do vocals, then they would scrap the vocals, and then we would go back and touch up guitars again. And here's the thing, it's so easy to get caught in that trap of endlessly wanting to tweak your work. So here is what I suggest. Publicly announce when you're gonna release your project. That's right. Go out there and tell your fans, even if you only have a handful of fans, even if your fans right now are just your friends and family, that your album or EP or single will be released on this date. So you are obligated to deliver the product by that date. The pressure from the deadline, although can be stressful seemingly, will force you to wrap up the project and not overthink it. Because here's the truth, production and mixing is an ongoing process and you will be learning forever. I've been doing this for 15 years and I'm still learning and I'm still progressing. Growth is part of the process. There's no such thing as a perfect mix. There's no such thing as a perfect piece of music. And as creatives, we can tweak things till the end of time. The secret is to work on a high volume of different music and to release music and mix different songs regularly. So Adam, I hope that helps, and definitely keep me posted on your progress, because what you mentioned definitely hits home because I've been there. Okay, and our next question here comes from Mr. North BDC96. I know it's easier to edit guitars when you have a DI because you can visually see the transients clear, but what happens if a client gives you a session without any DIs? How do you go about editing guitars? Well, dude, this is a great question, and I'm gonna be completely honest with you. I will not take projects if the client doesn't send me DIs. For two reasons. Number one, it's very difficult to edit. And number two, most people don't know how to record a decent guitar tone, so you're left with a guitar tone that's unfixable and you can't reamp it. But with that being said, back in the day, I used to take more projects that were sent my way. And what I would do in these situations is just edit the guitar tracks mainly by ear and by just, visually looking. You can still see some transient information even if it's an amp track. It's a lot more difficult than working with a DI, but you can still do it. So I would just focus more on the bigger picture of the guitar. So if they sound like they're rushing, just pull them back slightly. Or if they sound like they're really behind or out of sync, you can do it by ear and you can kind of line up your guitars and get them a little more in sync. It's also really easy to cut out dead space on an amp track. You don't need a DI for that. So yeah, man, I wish I could give you a magic bullet answer, but the truth is editing amp tracks is not the easiest thing in the world, but sometimes you gotta do it painstakingly and by ear without the help of a clean DI track, which everyone should be recording in 2021, but for some reason, people still don't. But dude, I feel your pain. I've mixed a ton of records, especially records that were done out of home studios with people who weren't professional engineers that didn't track DIs, and I had to put in the work in order to deliver a product that was professional. Thank you for your question. It was a good one. Okay, and our next question here comes from George. Hi Bobby, thanks for sharing your expertise with all of us. I've watched almost all of your YouTube videos and they have been very helpful. However, I was wondering how your effect sends/buses work together with your pre-master /buses/stems. Now, George writes a bunch of stuff here, but I'm gonna sum up what he's asking because it's an excellent question. Now, if you're producing a lot of modern metal for a lot of modern bands, more often than not, they're gonna ask you for stems at the end of the recording project. Now, here's the problem here. People have been using the word stems incorrectly. Stems are not kick drum, snare drum, guitar one, guitar DI, vocal lead, vocal double. Those are not stems. Those are individual raw tracks. What a stem actually is a simple stereo file that contains a group of instruments. That's what stems have been historically, and for some reason people started using the term stems incorrectly, and it's causing a lot of confusion. So what George is referring to are actual stems. So for example, if a DJ wants to remix a song that I worked on and add 808s and make a an electronic music version or hip hop version out of the metal track, they will ask for stems. So a drum stem containing just the drum track, a guitar stem that contains all the guitars, leads, everything guitar related in the mix, including guitar effects. And the same thing for vocals, lead vocals, backgrounds, overdubs, and maybe my synths stem, which contains all of the synths from my track. So what I do is in my sessions, for the most part, I have like individual master faders for groups of instruments, including their sound effects, and I call them stem tracks. So when a producer or someone else asks for stems of my mix, I can just highlight the buses in my DAW, right click, and export the stems without having to do any extra work. Because a lot of times people will ask you for stem tracks a year, 2 years, 3 years later after the project has been wrapped up. So in other words, it makes my life a million times easier. Instead of having to go into my mix, solo tracks, oh wait, I forgot to solo this one delay. It just saves a ton of time. Now what George is asking is a great question. Pretty much what he's asking is, let's say you have a reverb, for example. You're using that reverb for your snare drum and your lead guitar and your vocals. Now, if you do this whole stem thing that I mentioned where you just export your stems, there's gonna be bleed in that reverb from multiple instrument groups. So for example, if I export my vocal stem that's using the same reverb from my drums, you're gonna have drum reverb in with your vocal stem. That's a problem. That's not a real stem track. It's not clean. You're having some crosstalk there. So the way that I kind of combat this is I don't let instruments share send effects when I utilize this whole stem approach as far as exporting stem tracks for the band. So I won't have my drums sharing a reverb with my vocals or my guitars or anything else. All of my guitar reverbs and delays are specific only to guitars. All of my drum reverbs are specific only to my drums, and the same goes for vocals. They all have their own effects and anything else in the mix. Now, sometimes I'm gonna be honest, I like to keep my mixes even simpler, and if it's a band that I feel are more old school and they're not gonna ask for stems 2 years down the line, I won't use stem mixes. In other words, I won't set up these buses at the end of my sessions. In these situations, I'll happily have a guitar, vocal, or drum share a reverb. For me, it feels way more analog because this is how producers would mix on a console. If you only had one delay unit back in your rack, multiple instruments had to share that delay unit. I really enjoy working this way. And I used to do it most of the time like this, but again, at the time when I was doing 5,000 different gent bands in the studio, everyone started asking for stems, and it just became easier to set up these stem tracks. So George, I hope this answers your question. If you're using this stem track approach, like you asked, you can't have groups of instruments or different instruments share the same send effects. It won't work, at least as far as exporting stems is concerned. Again, thank you for your question. It was a good one. All right, and our next question here comes from Carl. I gotta ask, when we say rhythm guitars and bass should be in the pocket time-wise with the drums, what is the sort of millisecond threshold for something considered tight versus clinically quantized to the grid? I have rhythm guitar tracks that I consider tight but are slightly off when you zoom real far in. I'm not sure if they need to be even tighter for a professional mix. Thanks so much if anyone can answer this. Okay, well, Carl, this is an excellent question, and the simple answer is there are no rules that you have to follow as far as the exact milliseconds or the exact tightness of your tracks. I'm gonna share with you my philosophy when it comes to this topic. Most of the time, I want my productions sounding natural, like a tight band playing in front of me. In these situations, I don't need every single little pick attack to be 1000% on the grid or with the drums, as long as they're in the pocket. When I say in the pocket, what I mean is they're not pushing ahead of the drums or each other. The worst thing in the world is when a guitar is pushing the drum tracks and the bass is pushing the drum tracks track and being behind the drum track and then pushing the drum tracks, and then the other guitar player is maybe behind. When you have all of the different instruments all over the place like that, generally it'll just sound sloppy and it'll be very difficult to mix. So I follow a very simple rule of thumb. I just make sure all of my tracks are on the grid or slightly behind. They don't have to be 1000% tight. I don't pay attention to the milliseconds or anything like that. Now, with that being said, certain genres of metal or subgenres of metal like gent, for example, you really gotta make sure all of the pick attacks are super duper in sync with the double kick patterns and with each other. That is just the nature of that genre of music as a whole. Not my cup of tea personally. I've done a ton of that in the past. I prefer a much more natural production. Still tight, still clear, still professional, but I don't really care to have my guitars ridiculously tight where it sounds like, you know, the T1000 is performing all the guitar tracks. So dude, don't get caught up in numbers. Don't worry about the exact milliseconds. You're gonna drive yourself nuts. Play it by ear and make sure that you don't have certain pick attacks ahead of the grid and certain ones behind the grid. In general, at least with your rhythm guitars, it's really not gonna feel right. Again, the way I look at it is either dead on or slightly behind, and I'm good to rock. So Carl, thanks for your question. Keep me posted on your progress with your productions. Okay, and our final question here comes from insert your name here. Hey Bobby, maybe a question for your next Q&A. I recently started adding synths to metal songs, and some of those tones are similar to guitar, therefore clash with each other frequency-wise. How would you approach it as for EQ and panning? Maybe I should use some mid-side things? Or I don't know. All right, man, well, this is a great question, and I'm gonna be honest with you, I don't mess with any of that fancy mid-side stuff. I just stick to simple, classic mixing techniques. So the way I think of it, especially when I'm working on rock or heavy rock and metal, which is generally what I do 99% of the time, for me, guitars always take priority. So I do as little EQing to my guitar tracks as possible. I want them to sound natural and I want them to be in the forefront and the main focus. Now, with that being said, I do a lot of mixing where there are tons of extra production elements like synths, background effects, all kinds of stuff. But here's the good news. For example, I'm mixing a project right now. Actually, it's very similar to what you're asking. They have a ton of synth layers going on that are in the exact same range as my guitar tracks. I'm not gonna go in there notching out a bunch of frequencies on my guitar tracks. I'm simply gonna low and high pass my guitars, just minimal amount of EQ to get the tone right. Then I bring in these other elements like these extra synth layers, and to be honest with you, man, more often than not, it's just a matter of level. In other words, if there's a section that I do want the synths to cut through more, I will duck my guitars down with some basic volume automation. Now, in cases where there is a lot of conflict as far as frequency response is concerned on these extra layers, I will make sure I'll cut from the layers and not touch my guitar tracks. So for example, if there's a lot of 1K happening in a synth that's sitting very closely as far as frequency response to my rhythm guitars, I'll happily cut from the synth and leave my guitars as they are. Now, if I send my mix to the band and they're complaining that they can't hear the synths for one section of the song, then I know for a fact that they want the synth in that section of the song to take center stage. And it's a matter of simple volume automation on my rhythm guitars. Taking your rhythm guitars and bringing them down a dB or a dB and a half, maybe even 2 dB, is a great technique because a listener isn't even aware of it, but it creates a lot of extra space in certain sections for your overdubs and your synths. I do this a whole lot, especially when it comes to busy technical music where there's a million different layers. So my advice to you is to please not overthink this. Don't worry about using some crazy, overly complicated mixing technique. You're better off sticking with the classics, at least in my opinion. And in this case, volume automation and cutting from your synth tracks, which should be secondary in a metal mix most of the time. So dude, thank you so much for your submission and good luck with your future projects. I would just like to shout out and thank everyone for their questions. And if you've sent me a question that I haven't gotten to yet, just be patient. I will definitely get to it within one of the upcoming videos in this series. If you found this video helpful, like, comment, subscribe, and share. And do not forget to click the little bell icon so you can be notified every time I upload one of my weekly videos on all things metal and rock production. If you're interested in some Frightbox swag, I've got t-shirts, mugs, and other cool stuff on the way. There's a link below to the Frightbox merch store in this video's description. If you're struggling with guitar tone, struggle no more. You could download my impulse response of my favorite Mesa Boogie cab out of my studio. It's an oversized cab with V30 speakers, mic'd with a single SM57 on the right spot. Load it into your favorite amp sim plugin and get right to dialing in killer metal guitar tone with absolute ease. There's a link to the free impulse response below in the video's description box. And until next time, happy mixing.